I'm Jimmy, and for years I thought I understood the world until insomnia, empty nights, and a sense that life was happening around me, not through me, started to reveal something I couldn't ignore. What if the truths we rely on every day, beliefs, rituals, what we call morality, are only shadows of something far deeper? Jesus knew humanity was heading for this, and the alien revealed what he tried to stop. It wasn't chaos, disaster, or divine punishment. It was far more subtle, internal, and dangerous. Tonight, I'll take you through the moments that changed everything I thought I knew, revealing a reality so hidden it almost slips through perception. Before we dive in, hit like if you're ready to question everything. Share this with someone who senses life is louder than it should be. Subscribe for the full journey and comment where you're listening from. This story isn't just mine, it's a mirror, and the first step towards seeing it clearly begins now. My name is Jimmy, and I have not slept properly in years, not because my body refuses rest, but because my mind never truly powers down. There is always a low hum behind my thoughts, like an unseen machine running in the walls, subtle but constant, impossible to escape once you become aware of it. Doctors told me I was healthy. Friends told me I was just stressed. They offered advice that sounded kind but empty. Drink less coffee. Exercise more. Think positive. None of it touched the real problem. Because the real problem was not physical. It was existential. Something in me had gone slightly out of alignment. And once that shift happened, everything began to feel unreal in a way I could not explain to anyone else. Life continued on the surface exactly as it always had. Work, messages, small talk, screens glowing in dark rooms, people laughing at jokes they had heard 100 times, conversations looping through the same predictable opinions. I participated because that is what people do. You nod. You respond. You play the role. But somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling like a participant and started feeling like an observer trapped inside my own life. It was as if everyone else had received a script I had somehow misplaced. The noise of the world never stopped. Notifications, opinions, arguments, performative outrage, manufactured urgency, everything demanding attention and nothing offering depth. Even silence had become rare, and when it did appear, most people rushed to fill it with something, anything, afraid of what might surface if they stayed still too long. I began to realize that the exhaustion I felt was not from doing too much, but from never touching anything real. There was a growing suspicion in me that something essential was missing, not just from my life, but from the structure of everything around me. Like a building that looks intact from the outside, but has lost its foundation. You can still walk through it. You can still pretend it is stable. But on some deeper level, you know it is only a matter of time. At night, when the world finally quieted enough to reveal its hollowness, the hum inside me grew louder. That was when the questions came. Not dramatic questions, not philosophical debates, just a simple, persistent feeling that I was present for something I did not understand yet, like standing in a dark room before the light turns on. The more I paid attention, the more uneasy everything became, as if awareness itself were dissolving a veil I had relied on my entire life. I started noticing patterns that felt too precise to be coincidence. People used the same phrases with the same emotional weight, as though their reactions had been pre-selected. Outrage appeared on schedule. Sympathy appeared on schedule. Even silence seemed coordinated. Online spaces felt less like conversations and more like rehearsals, with millions repeating lines they had not written. It was subtle enough to dismiss and persistent enough to haunt me. I tested it quietly. I asked open questions and watched how quickly responses collapsed into familiar scripts. I listened for originality and heard only variations of borrowed language. Everyone sounded convinced, and yet no one sounded present. It felt like watching reflections argue with reflections. The realization did not make me feel superior. It made me feel alone. If this was happening to everyone, then why was no one talking about it? If it was only happening to me, then what did that say about my own stability? The most disturbing part was how predictable everything became once I saw the pattern. News cycles moved like tides. Moral outrage rose and fell on command. Personal identities seemed assembled from available templates. People did not choose their positions. They adopted them. They defended them. They suffered for them, all without ever pausing to ask where those positions came from. It felt less like society and more like momentum. I began to suspect that most people were not actively living their lives, but were being carried by invisible currents they could not perceive. There was no villain, no conspiracy, only a gradual surrender of attention that had become normal. Comfort had replaced curiosity. Reaction had replaced awareness. Speed had replaced depth. Once I saw it, I could not unsee it. The world did not change. My perception did. That shift was isolating. Friends felt farther away even when sitting beside me. Conversations became performances I could predict before they began. It was like discovering that everyone was speaking a language I had once known fluently but could no longer believe in. And beneath that growing dissonance, there was a quiet intuition that this pattern was not random, that it was building towards something, and that I was not merely observing it but being prepared. I began walking at night because daylight had become too crowded with expectation. The late hours felt honest, stripped of performance, leaving only empty streets, distant traffic, and the soft echo of my own footsteps. There was a small park near my apartment that I visited without thinking, a place that had always been forgettable enough to feel safe. That night, the air felt altered, not colder, not warmer, just attentive, as though something invisible had turned toward me. I noticed the light before I noticed the figure. It was not bright enough to illuminate the trees, yet it made the shadows look deliberate. It felt misplaced, like a memory projected onto the present. My instinct was to explain it away, but explanation failed before it formed. Within that faint glow stood a presence that did not move and did not invite interpretation. It was simply there. The stillness around it felt structured, as though the ordinary flow of moments had been interrupted by something more precise. I did not feel fear, yet I did not feel comfort. What I felt was accuracy, the sensation of being observed by something that was not guessing. My thoughts slowed without effort, like sediment settling in clear water. I did not hear sound, yet a message arrived with certainty that did not belong to imagination. The words were simple and complete, carrying no emotion, yet leaving none absent. You are finally noticing. The meaning felt older than language, as though it had been waiting for my attention rather than for my ears. I understood without reasoning that this moment was not random. The park had not changed. The night had not changed. Something in me had shifted just enough to register what had always been present. The realization did not arrive with excitement. It arrived with inevitability, the quiet recognition that a door had opened not outward but inward, and that stepping through it would alter everything I thought I understood about solitude, perception, and the fragile boundary between what is seen and what chooses to be seen. I remained standing there long after the message faded, uncertain whether time had moved forward or merely pretended to. The world felt thinner, like a veil stretched too far to hide what lingered behind it. Somewhere beyond comprehension, a threshold had acknowledged me, and the knowing of that recognition settled quietly within chest. I did not know whether I was standing inside a dream or inside the first clear moment of my life. The distinction felt irrelevant, as though both possibilities led to the same consequence. The presence remained where it was, unchanged, while my own sense of time loosened, stretching in unfamiliar ways. Thoughts rose and dissolved before forming conclusions. Meaning arrived without structure. Understanding came without effort. What unfolded between us could not be described as conversation in the human sense. There were no gestures, no rhythm of interruption, no emotional cues to guide interpretation. Information appeared inside me in precise fragments, each complete on its own, each resting beside the next without argument or urgency. The presence identified itself as Jax, not as a name chosen, but as a functional approximation of something that did not belong to human language. Jax conveyed that observation was not an activity but a condition, a constant state of awareness directed toward patterns rather than individuals. Humanity was one pattern among many, not special, not insignificant, simply one expression of a larger process that repeated across environments and forms. The implication was not insulting. It was neutral, almost gentle in its detachment. I sensed that I was not the first person to stand where I stood, and not the first to feel the subtle fracture between what is assumed and what is perceived. Others had reached similar thresholds in different eras, under different skies, carrying different names. Civilizations, Jax revealed, do not progress in straight lines. They move in cycles of coherence and fragmentation, awareness and distraction, presence and surrender. The current moment was not unique. It was familiar. There was no tone of warning, yet the weight of inevitability pressed quietly against every realization. Societies reach a stage where complexity exceeds consciousness, where systems outgrow understanding, where identity becomes externalized and meaning outsourced. At that point, something fundamental begins to shift. Not always visibly, not always violently. Sometimes the collapse occurs so slowly that those living inside it mistake deterioration for normality. I felt small, but not diminished. I felt ordinary, but not irrelevant. The strange comfort came from knowing that confusion itself was not new, that my private sense of dislocation echoed a pattern older than memory. Whatever was unfolding around me was not chaos. It was structure too large to be seen from within. When the flow of information softened, I realized my hands were trembling. Not from fear, but from the quiet strain of having something invisible rearranged inside me. The park still existed. The night still breathed. Yet the ordinary world now felt like a thin surface stretched over a depth I had only just begun to sense. The question formed before I knew I intended to ask it, rising from a place deeper than thought, as though it had been waiting for permission. I wondered whether the world itself was unraveling, or whether I was simply becoming more fragile with age, more anxious, more sensitive to things that had always been present. The uncertainty did not feel intellectual. It felt existential, like standing on shifting ground and needing to know whether the earth was moving or whether my balance had changed. The response from Jax arrived without urgency, without persuasion, without comfort. It did not deny the instability I sensed, yet it reframed it with unsettling precision. What I perceived as collapse was not beginning in buildings or systems or institutions. It was beginning inside perception itself. The loss was not primarily social. It was internal. A slow erosion of presence that occurred long before any external failure could be measured. The idea unsettled me because it offered no enemy to resist and no catastrophe to point toward. If collapse began within consciousness, then it was not something imposed from outside. It was something chosen, moment by moment, through inattention. Jax conveyed that identity itself had become fragmented, divided into roles and performances, until the original coherence beneath them had grown faint. People no longer experienced themselves as unified beings, but as collections of reactions, preferences, and borrowed narratives. The most disturbing implication was that nothing dramatic was required for decline to take hold. No invasion, no disaster, no singular event, only the gradual surrender of awareness, a quiet trade of depth for distraction, a willingness to accept surface meaning in place of lived understanding. The loss occurred so gently that it was rarely noticed, and because it was rarely noticed, it was rarely resisted. I felt a strange grief for something I could not name. Not for the world as it appeared, but for the world as it might have been if attention had been valued more than comfort. The realization that I might be witnessing the early stages of something invisible and vast left me without reference points. It was not fear that settled in me. It was responsibility. If the fracture began within perception, it could only be answered through awareness and presence, not through escape. The insight felt heavier than fear, like responsibility settling quietly and refusing to leave. With permanence, the explanation unfolded with the same quiet certainty, not as instruction but as recognition of patterns that had always existed beneath attention. Jax conveyed that civilizations rarely fall when their enemies arrive or when their inventions exceed control. Those events are only the final visible symptoms. The true collapse begins earlier, in subtler places, where no headlines gather. It begins when people abandon inner authority and slowly replace it with borrowed certainty. Conscience becomes outsourced to systems, to institutions, to crowds, to metrics, until the individual no longer feels responsible for discernment. Judgment becomes repetition. Choice becomes habit. The loss is so gradual that it feels like convenience rather than surrender. Silence, Jax revealed, is the first capacity to erode. Not the absence of sound, but the inner stillness where awareness gathers and perception sharpens. When silence disappears, people lose the ability to hear their own experience without interference. Every moment becomes filled with stimulation. Every pause becomes uncomfortable. Without silence, reflection weakens. Without reflection, identity fragments. Fear then replaces awareness as the primary navigational force. Decisions become reactions. Attention narrows. The unknown becomes intolerable. People begin shaping their lives not around truth, but around avoidance. They seek constant reassurance that they are aligned with the group, that they are safe within the script. Over time, this fear-based orientation becomes normalized, even celebrated. The fragmentation Jax described was not psychological metaphor but structural reality. Individuals divided into roles that never met each other. The public self detached from the private self. The online self detached from embodied experience. The thinking self detached from feeling. With each separation, coherence weakened. By the time external systems begin to fracture, the internal cohesion of the population has already dissolved. Societies do not shatter because infrastructure fails. Infrastructure fails because the inner architecture of human attention has already collapsed. No technology, no governance, no ideology can compensate for the loss of presence. The knowledge did not arrive as warning. It arrived as observation. Civilizations that remember awareness evolve. Civilizations that forget repeat the cycle. The unsettling implication was that nothing needed to be destroyed for everything to be lost. It only required neglect. I felt the weight of that truth settle slowly, not as despair but as clarity. If collapse begins within, then continuity must begin there as well. The future of anything meaningful did not depend on events beyond control. The words arrived inside me with a calm inevitability, as if the story had been waiting for my recognition. Jax revealed that the trajectory I was beginning to sense was neither new nor unique. Across many worlds, in forms I could barely comprehend, the same sequence repeated. Civilizations reached points of awareness, and in those rare moments, an individual or a few individuals would awaken first. Their clarity, their insight, radiated outward, stirring others to question, to feel, to notice. For a fleeting time, presence became contagious, and awareness grew like a fragile flame in the dark. But the initial surge rarely lasted. Human or sentient tendency leaned toward containment, toward naming and shaping the uncontainable. Institutions arose, not maliciously, but inevitably. Structures formed to preserve the message, to organize its influence, to translate it into something manageable. Authority replaced experience. Rituals replaced understanding. The raw, immediate resonance of awakening became filtered through layers of interpretation that gradually hardened into dogma. Jax made it clear that this was not failure in the moral sense. It was pattern. The essence that initially sparked life within a civilization was diluted, absorbed into structures that were designed for survival rather than transformation. The original impulse became codified, repeated, and eventually detached from the immediacy that had given it power. Reverence replaced imitation. Worship replaced engagement. What had been meant as lived experience became a system of observation, a structure people could follow without awakening themselves. The observation was precise, dispassionate, yet somehow weighty in its implication. I could feel the echo of countless civilizations, their lessons encoded in a rhythm I was only beginning to hear. Awareness rose and spread, brief and bright. Authority formed around it. Clarity dimmed. Essence was lost. And the cycle began again. Quietly, almost unnoticed. Hearing it this way, the universe no longer felt infinite in its possibilities. It felt patterned, as though free will had boundaries not of law, but of recurrence. The moment of awakening was real, yet fragile. The systems that followed were inevitable. I realized that noticing this pattern was not simply understanding the past. It was a warning, a guide, and a mirror for what might be happening now. And in that recognition, I felt the quiet insistence that seeing the pattern mattered more than I could yet measure. The world had its script, but awareness, however brief, had the power to bend it before momentum reclaimed everything. The question emerged quietly, almost despite myself, as if it had been waiting in the corners of thought for the right moment. I asked the name, and immediately the air felt heavier, as though time itself had thickened around it. Nothing moved, not the light, not the shadows, not the presence before me. There was no shift of posture, no gesture, yet the weight of recognition settled so fully that it was almost tactile. I realized the silence was not denial. It was acknowledgement. A pause demanded by something far older than comprehension. A pause that refused interpretation. I became aware of the faint sound of my own breathing and the impossibility of separating it from the presence. The night had altered subtly, the edges of perception sharpening. What had been ordinary, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of a city, now felt like background to a signal, a quiet insistence that demanded attention. I did not move, did not speak further. To speak further would have been intrusion, premature, like touching a wire before the current was intended to flow. The recognition in the stillness communicated without form, without voice, without metaphor. It carried a weight I could not quantify, the sense that certain words, certain truths, cannot be released casually, cannot be encountered without preparation. The pause was a mirror of something deeper, something that had always existed in the margins of memory, waiting for awareness to reach it. I felt my chest tighten as I understood, even dimly, that this was not about history, about story, about culture. It was about resonance, about essence, about a continuity of presence that humans rarely perceived directly. The name was a key, not a label. It unlocked awareness in ways that language alone could never capture. To speak it aloud was to summon alignment, to call attention, to demand recognition from the mind as much as the environment. The realization settled like sediment. It was not fear that accompanied it, not awe, not even anticipation. It was gravity, a pull that made the world feel both thinner and more immense simultaneously. For a moment, I understood that this recognition was not mine alone, that I had stepped into a pattern repeated across time and space, a hinge on which understanding turned. The name carried consequence, but consequence not of punishment or reward, only of presence. And in that quiet, impossible space, I waited, fully awake to the pause, to what would come next, and to the truth that some knowledge must always be met before it can be spoken. The quiet after the name stretched long enough that I began to feel time as something elastic, something capable of stretching and folding around awareness itself. And then the message arrived. Not spoken, not projected, but placed directly into thought with a precision that bypassed doubt. Jax explained that what I had been sensing in the pause was recognition of a trajectory, not a rumor of history or a prophecy of events. Jesus, Jax said, had not foretold collapse or chaos. He had observed consciousness itself with such clarity that the patterns were obvious, unfolding like rivers, inevitably carving valleys. He saw the repetitions, the cycles of surrender and distraction, the subtle erosion of presence, and understood that without intervention, the flow would continue unchecked. Intervention was not about control, not about power. It was about perception and guidance, about revealing the underlying structure to those who could notice and choose differently. I realized slowly that this reframed everything I thought I knew about prediction. Foretelling the future was not about seeing events as objects detached from awareness. It was seeing awareness itself, seeing the tendencies embedded in thought, attention, and collective focus, and understanding the consequences that naturally emerged from them. Patterns unfolded across time in ways invisible to those fully immersed, but obvious to those who observed the mind as much as the world. Jax conveyed that the clarity Jesus possessed was not granted lightly. It was not divine in the sense I had always assumed. It was complete observation paired with consistent presence, the ability to perceive threads of intent and reaction long before they manifested as external action. The moments of teaching, of insistence on love, of warning, were not symbolic only. They were precise interventions at the level of consciousness, nudges aimed at redirecting attention, at breaking cycles before they calcified into structure. I felt the weight of that insight settle in a way that made ordinary life seem simultaneously smaller and larger. Human behavior, institutions, culture, all of it moved with an inevitability unless someone or something inserted clarity into the pattern. And he had. Not by imposing will, not by demanding obedience, but by illuminating the pathways, by giving consciousness a mirror to its own trajectory. The silence that followed carried understanding more than comfort. I realized that awareness itself could bend outcomes, and that the measure of intervention was subtle, internal, and almost invisible to those not already observing. I understood that the work had always been inside perception, not outside, and that noticing it was the first step toward anything that might change the inevitable. The words arrived slowly, each one settling like a stone into the quiet of my mind. Jax explained that Jesus was not speaking primarily about punishment or catastrophe, not about fires that would scorch or armies that would march. The danger he sought to prevent was quieter, more insidious, and far easier to miss. It was the erosion of the human interior, the slow surrender of attention to external authority, the outsourcing of responsibility for thought, feeling, and perception. Civilization's collapse did not start with events. It began in consciousness, and that was what he had seen, what he had tried to stop. I understood, dimly at first, that most teachings I had been exposed to were misdirected toward fear, toward obedience, toward distance from the self. Warnings about sin, damnation, and judgment were, Jax implied, scaffolding that obscured the true lesson. The true lesson was that people could forget themselves, give away their awareness, and substitute belief for lived experience. Worship, as it had been taught for centuries, encouraged distance. It kept the observer outside, looking at a model rather than living it. Jesus, in contrast, had attempted to re-anchor attention, to show the immediate path where consciousness could be exercised directly, where responsibility could be assumed, where the interior could guide the exterior. Jacques made it clear that this was neither metaphorical nor symbolic. The collapse of internal authority was measurable, even across time and culture, by the patterns of obedience, the replacement of curiosity with ritual, the repetition of scripts that had lost their origin. When humans replaced attention with belief, they ceded their capacity to act with insight. When they replaced action with worship, they disconnected from the consequences of living fully, becoming, as Jacques said, participants in rehearsal rather than the unfolding of reality. I felt a strange dread as the implications sank in. What I had assumed was the natural order, the structures of society, the hierarchies of faith, the inherited systems of morality, could be the very mechanisms by which essence was lost. Jesus had not been attempting to prevent chaos in the streets. He had been attempting to preserve the capacity for presence, the ability for humanity to inhabit its own consciousness without surrendering to convenience, habit, or fear. Every parable, every insistence on love, every admonition to notice, to choose, to forgive, was calibrated to reawaken what had been slipping away unnoticed. The thought that a single life could carry such intent, such precision, staggered me. I began to perceive that the subtlety of his mission explained why history had so easily obscured it. If people were conditioned to externalize authority, they could follow rituals endlessly without ever experiencing the interior lesson. And so, what was essential was ignored, replaced, domesticated. Humanity could endure all manner of hardship and still miss the true danger, because the danger was invisible, internal, and almost impossible to name until one felt the absence of it within oneself. Jacques's presence felt heavier then, as if the weight of what had been attempted and what had failed pressed into the space around me. I realized that understanding this required no rush of action, no dramatic intervention. The shift he sought to prevent began first with perception, with noticing, with quiet insistence on the interior. And it required recognition that the world outside would always reflect what had been abandoned inside. Awareness was the threshold. Everything else was consequence. The silence that followed Jacques's earlier words seemed to thicken, as if the air itself waited for comprehension to catch up to the weight of what had been revealed. The message, he said, had always been clear, but clarity alone was insufficient when the receivers of insight were conditioned to look elsewhere. Jesus had not spoken of distant kingdoms, intermediaries, or structures of control. He had spoken of the kingdom within, the immediacy of connection, the equality of being that placed each consciousness on the same axis of responsibility and access. Direct experience was the only conduit, and imitation was the path. No hierarchy, no intermediary, no ritual could replace the encounter that occurred within the attentive mind. And yet, history had shown a different trajectory. Over centuries, what was meant to awaken became codified, and codification required control. Authority replaced connection. Hierarchy replaced direct experience. The subtle insistence on awareness, on internal responsibility, was translated into external obedience. Salvation became something granted rather than exercised, and the pathway of lived embodiment was obscured behind layers of ceremony, dogma, and mediated interpretation. Jacques described this as inversion, not merely corruption, not a misinterpretation. The functional meaning of the original lessons had been flipped, so that the outcomes encouraged dependence, distance, and inattention rather than presence, participation, and engagement. Where Jesus had demonstrated that love, forgiveness, and service were active, internal choices that reshaped being, the structures that followed made these qualities abstract, externalized, removed from immediate practice, and thus powerless in their original intention. I felt the pattern like a vibration beneath the surface of thought, subtle but insistent. The teachings that had once promised awakening had been made comfortable to follow, yet incapable of delivering the transformation they had originally carried. Repetition replaced discernment. Admiration replaced imitation. Words existed, but the effect had shifted. The invisible scaffolding had become the visible goal, and the life it produced was one of observation rather than enactment, of echo rather than resonance. The insight carried both clarity and dread. I began to perceive why the urgency in Jesus' actions had always seemed paradoxical. He had confronted not only the flaws of human desire but the tendency of structure to absorb vitality, the way power reinterprets resonance into ritual, the way instruction can become a substitute for experience. The message had not been lost in translation. It had been inverted in function, a mirror showing the opposite of what it intended. And in that inversion lay the subtle threat that Jacques had been pointing to. Humanity could feel attentive, devoted, and moral, while simultaneously asleep. As the understanding settled, I sensed that the challenge was no longer about belief or alignment with dogma. It was about perception itself, about the ability to see the inversion, to notice the difference between resonance and reflection, presence and performance. The world had adopted the form without the essence, and only a conscious interior could reclaim what had been deliberately obscured, what had always been intended to be lived rather than observed. The night felt colder somehow. Or perhaps it was the gravity of what Jacques conveyed that made the air itself seem heavier. The parables, he said, had never been riddles to puzzle the mind or allegories to decorate memory. They were instructions, subtle and deliberate, designed to cultivate perception, to teach consciousness, to notice patterns in the flow of life that were invisible to those who only watched superficially. Each story, each image, each moment of narrative tension was a tool, a training device for the mind to move beyond reaction, beyond assumption, beyond the habitual loop of superficial comprehension. I realized slowly that everything I had been taught to interpret as mystery or faith was actually an exercise in attention. The parables were calibrated to reveal the unseen structures of human thought and behavior. They asked not for memorization, not for recitation, but for recognition, for the internal shift that occurs when a person perceives the pattern before it fully manifests. They were cognitive signals, almost imperceptible, waiting for a mind capable of pausing long enough to feel the connections beneath the surface. Jacques explained that each parable carried multiple layers of resonance, accessible not all at once, but sequentially, contingent on the readiness of the observer. A person who approached them merely as moral lessons or doctrinal guidance received only the surface. They could recite the phrases, nod at the morals, and yet remain unchanged. The structure of comprehension was not enough. The consciousness had to meet the story, inhabit it, sense its currents, and let the recognition unfold organically within the interior space. I felt a strange vertigo thinking about how this method had always been subtle and invisible. The parables were timing devices, teaching patience, observation, and pattern recognition. They guided attention without forcing it, creating openings in perception that only the ready could enter. They were the framework through which internal resonance could be aligned with action, with awareness, with the capacity to see the trajectory of thought, emotion, and choice before it solidified into habit or structure. It became clear that the common understanding of these stories had been inverted over centuries. What was meant to awaken was turned into ornament. What was meant to cultivate was transformed into doctrine. What was meant to train perception became a tool for repetition. The subtlety of intention was nearly impossible to preserve when human inclination favored certainty over inquiry, hierarchy over interior observation. The weight of comprehension settled in the space between us. Awareness, Jacques said, was the foundation. The parables were not lessons for the passive mind, but invitations to enter a process of noticing, a process that could reshape consciousness itself. They were the practical embodiment of seeing before acting, of knowing patterns before being trapped by them, of cultivating the interior faculties that civilization habitually abandoned. I understood, with a sudden clarity that felt like both relief and responsibility, that the stories were never optional. They were the mechanism by which the interior world of humanity could remain unlost amidst the predictable collapse of the external. I braced for judgment, a weight pressing down as though centuries of error had been stacked on my chest. Yet what arrived was not condemnation, but a clarity that cut deeper than shame ever could. Jax spoke of fear, not as accusation but as pattern, as the invisible current that had guided humanity for millennia. It was not evil that kept people from noticing, nor ignorance in the sense of inability, but a consistent, almost instinctive reluctance to confront the interior world. Fear, he said, had been far more persuasive than logic, more effective than coercion, because it offered comfort in avoidance, security in distraction, and the illusion of stability in surrender. I began to perceive how subtle this fear had been, how woven into every moment of attention it shaped choices long before they were conscious. People feared silence because it amplified the self they preferred not to meet. They feared responsibility because it demanded more than ritual or routine. It demanded presence, decision, and alignment with something that could not be deferred. The ego, fragile and habituated to self-preservation, had learned to resist dissolution, to insist on separation, and to reinterpret internal nudges as inconvenience or absurdity. In the quiet spaces between work, routine, and entertainment, the fear whispered that noticing, that perceiving without filters, might be unbearable. And the mind recoiled. Jax explained that the allure of unconsciousness was deceptively simple. To follow scripts, to defer to authority, to substitute belief for engagement, created a sense of continuity, a sense that one was alive without risking the instability of interior vigilance. The patterns of distraction, repetition, and mediated approval formed a scaffolding that felt safe, even as it quietly eroded the capacity for presence. It was easier, the alien said, to sleep while life unfolded than to meet the world with clarity, to carry the weight of awareness as a constant companion rather than a fleeting spark. The enormity of this insight made my chest tighten. Fear had not been loud or dramatic. It had been invisible, structural, almost imperceptible. The collapse Jesus sought to prevent was not the fall of cities, the outbreak of violence, or the spectacle of chaos. It was the silent erosion of interior authority, the gradual abandonment of choice, the subtle substitution of ceremony for participation, of reflection for action, of imitation for direct engagement. Humanity had been led, not by malice, but by the seduction of avoidance. By the ease of sleep, while the interior world quietly hollowed itself out, I realized, with a kind of reverent dread, that the solution was never in judgment or punishment. The antidote to this pattern was awareness, radical and persistent, sustained in the interior even when the exterior world offered distraction and reassurance. The courage required was not heroic in the conventional sense, but profoundly intimate. A willingness to sit in silence, to confront the self fully, to relinquish comfort, to practice the labor of living attention. Fear had been the architect of unconsciousness, and only noticing could dismantle it. I understood that what had been attempted, what had been resisted for centuries, depended entirely on the willingness of a consciousness to turn inward, to meet the unknown in the mirror of self, and to allow that encounter to shape every action outward. The world outside felt louder, sharper, more fragmented than ever. And yet the noise was only a shadow of what had been cultivated within. Jax explained that the patterns I had begun to notice, the subtle erosion of interior authority, were now manifesting in plain view. Civilization, he said, was showing its inner collapse through the behaviors that defined daily life. Identity was constructed not through reflection or alignment with being, but through performance, a constant curation of self to meet imagined expectations. People measured themselves in comparison to others, judged themselves against signals they could not fully understand, and surrendered their interior compass for the fleeting affirmation of screens and observers. Attention itself had become a battleground. Endless stimulation fractured focus, scattering thought across 1,000 competing demands, none of which required true engagement. Multitasking replaced presence, notifications replaced observation, and the quiet space necessary for noticing, for awareness, had been systematically colonized by external inputs. The constant pull of novelty, outrage, and spectacle ensured that internal reckoning was postponed indefinitely. The civilization Jax observed was awake only in superficial ways, responsive only to signals it could register without cost, without responsibility, without reflection. Outrage had become the default currency of social interaction. People reacted, they posted, they debated, but rarely did they pause to see the patterns driving their impulses. Anger and judgment circulated more freely than comprehension, creating feedback loops that reinforced distraction, conformity, and disconnection. Tribalism, both subtle and overt, replaced understanding. Alignment with ideas, groups, and labels took precedence over awareness of self, of the interior state that could evaluate, choose, and respond. The external structures mirrored the inner disintegration, signaling that collapse had long since begun, but invisibly, imperceptibly, in ways unnoticed by those living through it. Jax's voice seemed to vibrate through the stillness of the park, calm and precise. The expression of collapse was not dramatic, not sudden, not explosive. It was the slow, quiet surrender of interior life, a migration outward from the center of being into performance, distraction, and conformity. People lived outside themselves, inhabiting the currents of collective thought rather than the solidity of individual presence. The hum of habitual fear, the seduction of comfort, and the refusal to meet the self left civilization adrift, dependent on momentum rather than discernment. I felt a chill, realizing that the moment we called modernity, complexity, or advancement was, in Jax's terms, the stage at which humanity's internal collapse had begun to articulate externally. The patterns were obvious if one had learned to see: reactive outrage, shallow affiliation, fractured attention, and performance-driven identity. Yet for most, this was normal, unquestioned, invisible. The danger was not a sudden catastrophe but the normalization of drift, the habitual sleepwalking into consequence. Humanity was awake in form, asleep in essence, and the structures erected to manage life amplified the disconnection instead of correcting it. The interior erosion now had a mirror, a world increasingly populated by selves that existed only to perform rather than inhabit, to respond rather than observe, to react rather than choose. The silence between us stretched long, but it was not empty. It carried weight, a presence that pressed into thought and memory until I could feel the architecture of human interior life laid bare before me. Jax spoke with a precision that made even the ordinary sounds of the night seem loud, as if the world itself were listening. He said that the most dangerous shift in human history was not the building of empires, not the invention of weapons, nor the collapse of economies. It was far subtler, far more insidious. It was the moment when the collective posture of consciousness changed from "I am responsible for my own awareness" to "tell me what to believe." That surrender, that relinquishment of interior sovereignty, had set the course for centuries of dependency, for the normalization of obedience over discernment, for the extinction of genuine presence beneath the surface of apparent knowledge. I felt the truth of it ripple through me. The demand for instruction, the reliance on intermediaries, the eagerness to outsource judgment, all of it became a kind of collective anesthesia. People no longer trusted their own perception. They no longer tested the currents of thought and sensation within themselves against the reality they encountered. They sought answers from authority, from texts, from leaders, from rituals, from formulas that promised certainty without requiring the labor of interior engagement. In doing so, they forfeited the very faculty that allowed humanity to notice, to respond, to awaken. Structures multiplied, each one claiming legitimacy, but each one eroding the capacity for direct experience. Obedience replaced observation. Belief replaced discernment. External validation replaced inner alignment. Jax's presence was unyielding, yet somehow compassionate, as if he were holding a mirror to the invisible erosion, showing me not just the world but the interior collapse that made the world appear inevitable. The consequences of this shift were subtle at first, nearly imperceptible, but cumulative. People who believed instead of observing repeated patterns they did not understand. They followed instructions they did not question, even when those instructions contradicted the very faculties of awareness they had abandoned. They obeyed fear, deferred responsibility, and allowed intermediaries to define the contours of morality, meaning, and truth. Civilization did not break because it lacked knowledge. It broke because it relinquished the ability to perceive, to act from presence, to be sovereign in consciousness. I realized then that awakening was not a matter of acquiring information or memorizing doctrine. It was reclaiming a posture, a refusal to defer interior authority, a decision to inhabit consciousness fully. The most dangerous shift had not simply altered how people thought, it had altered the very mechanism by which humans could notice, respond, and create. It was a systemic vulnerability, written not in laws or technology, but in interior choices. Invisible, yet determinative, a quiet surrender repeated millions of times, generation after generation. The real danger was not chaos in the streets, but the stillness in the mind. The silence in the soul, the abdication of responsibility for awareness itself. The question lingered in the air like smoke, curling into every corner of thought and memory until I could feel it pressing against the walls I had built around myself. Jax asked it calmly, without urgency, yet it arrived with the force of a revelation. Who would I be without my conditioning, without the familiar labels I carried, without the habits that structured my days, without the fears that whispered constantly, without the borrowed beliefs I had clutched as shields against uncertainty? It was not a question to answer quickly, nor with words rehearsed over decades of habit. It demanded a confrontation with the raw interior self, stripped of scaffolding, stripped of performance, stripped of the illusions that had passed for identity. I tried to speak. My mind raced, listing titles, roles, achievements, opinions, preferences, the intricate latticework of everything I had come to consider me. Yet each word felt hollow, a reflection of the mirrors I had relied upon rather than a glimpse of what might truly dwell beneath. Labels evaporated as soon as I named them. Habits seemed empty without the context of repetition. Fears lost their immediacy, but revealed themselves as shadows tied to choices I had never truly made. Even the beliefs I thought were mine, principles, loyalties, moral frameworks, felt borrowed, echoing voices that had been louder than my own. The answer I had assumed existed, the self I believed stable, dissolved under the weight of the question. I felt exposed, naked to a reality I had avoided noticing. The interior world I had inhabited without awareness now demanded scrutiny, and I realized I had no authentic anchor. Everything I had relied upon to define myself, the patterns, the stories, the expectations, was provisional, contingent, borrowed, or rehearsed. And yet, beneath the surface, beneath the sediment of conditioning, I sensed a space, a silence, a potential. Something unnamed yet unbroken. It was not an answer, not a form, not a shape I could grasp. It was the still point of awareness that had always been present, overlooked, ignored, waiting for attention. Jax's presence was steady, a gravity that did not compel but simply reflected. The question had done its work. It had stripped away certainty, and in that exposure there was no shame, no punishment, only clarity. I understood, with a sudden, unsettling vividness, that identity as I had known it was a series of borrowed agreements with the world, a ledger of reactions and deferrals, and that the true self, the self unconditioned, unshaped, unafraid, remained invisible only because I had never asked to see it. The realization was disorienting. It was quiet, yet it shook every assumption. For the first time, I saw the scaffolding for what it was, and felt the vertigo of standing before the unconstructed self, an interior terrain I had never mapped, a consciousness unclaimed by expectation, waiting for the courage to inhabit it fully. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken recognition, and I could not answer. I did not have to. The question itself had begun the awakening. The quiet of the park felt heavier, denser, as if the night itself were leaning in to listen. Jax's presence remained precise, steady, neither pressing nor retreating. Yet every thought I carried felt illuminated, exposed in ways I had resisted noticing. He spoke without accusation, without judgment, his tone calm but unyielding. "You are still asleep," he said, and the words were simple, but the weight they carried was immense. I had assumed that awareness could be measured by understanding, by insight, by the ability to recognize patterns. I had assumed that noticing the noise, the loops, the emptiness around me was sufficient. But Jax's assessment shattered that assumption. Awareness was not a record of observations. It was a living presence, a choice made moment to moment, an interior fidelity that I had only flirted with, never inhabited fully. He began to trace the contours of my unconsciousness, pointing to the ways I curated my self-image, shaping behavior and expression to meet imagined expectations rather than allowing the raw, unedited self to emerge. Every polite nod, every carefully measured response, every identity I had crafted over years of habit became visible to me as performance, a barrier between experience and awareness. I realized that in trying to navigate life safely, I had surrendered the interior authority I thought I possessed. Every habit I relied upon, every repetitive thought, every prearranged moral script had become a cage, and I had mistaken it for freedom. Jax did not leave me in despair. Instead, he highlighted subtler patterns: the avoidance of uncomfortable truths, the gentle steering away from confrontation with the self, the reliance on familiar reactions that felt safe but repeated old limitations. Intellectual understanding had been my refuge, a way to convince myself that I knew without having to live the knowledge. I had collected observations, read insights, memorized principles, yet in practice, I remained bound by the inertia of habit, by the quiet acceptance of half-sleep, by the deferral of responsibility for my own consciousness. The difference between knowing and being had never been so stark. The park seemed quieter, yet I could feel an internal echo, a resonance of every overlooked moment. Awareness, Jax said, is the ongoing choice to inhabit yourself fully, to notice without judgment, to respond rather than react, to resist the seduction of comfort over truth. Every step I had taken without attention, every day I had deferred presence for convenience, every thought that had gone unexamined, these were the manifestations of sleep I still carried. The observation was gentle but absolute. There was no escape, no rationalization, no delay. The question was not whether I would wake, but whether I would notice that I had never truly been awake. And in that silence, I began to feel the first tremors of a presence that was both terrifying and alive. The possibility of inhabiting consciousness without deferral, of meeting myself fully without disguise, of stepping beyond the habitual into something unconstructed yet profoundly demanding. The night felt different this time, heavier in a way that carried significance rather than merely silence. Jax's presence, steady as always, seemed to draw the ambient stillness into focus, sharpening the contours of thought I had long ignored. He told me that the warnings Jesus offered were never merely broad or abstract, that the messages we assumed were intended for the masses were in fact intimately personal, each syllable aimed at the interior life of whoever could perceive it. Collapse, he said, does not begin with armies or markets or governments. It begins quietly, privately, in the unnoticed decisions a person makes when they choose comfort over truth, habit over awareness, distraction over presence. The world we see outside is only the reflection of countless moments like this, repeated endlessly, invisible until the sum of them produces the inevitable patterns of decline. I felt the weight of it pressing inward, the recognition that my own life had been full of these moments, so small, so inconsequential that I had never called them choices at all. Every glance I diverted from what was uncomfortable, every opinion repeated without examination, every time I silenced myself to avoid tension, every time I deferred judgment to some external authority, all of these were the private collapses that Jax referred to. They were invisible, and yet cumulative, invisible until the scale tipped. I had imagined myself awake, attentive, aware of the world's fragility, yet now I could see how deeply the interior surrender had taken root. Civilization is not lost in an instant. It is eroded in the quiet hours when individuals, myself included, allow their consciousness to fragment. The idea unsettled me because it demanded responsibility beyond the superficial. It was no longer enough to notice trends, patterns, injustices, or hypocrisies in the world. The focus had to turn inward, into the unlit chambers of the self, into the private agreements I had made with convenience and fear, into the moments where choice could have been exercised but was abandoned. Each act of avoidance, each habitual escape from discomfort, each lapse in interior vigilance was a signal, an invitation for entropy to grow unnoticed. Jesus, Jax explained, had been attempting to intervene at this level, planting instructions that were practical, immediate, and interior, designed to awaken individual consciousness before patterns of dependence and distraction became irreversible. I realized then that the personal dimension of the warning meant that the stakes were intimate and precise. It was not enough to hope for societal awakening or to observe the decay from a distance. The question was whether I, in this exact moment, would choose awareness over the habitual drift, whether I would inhabit my consciousness fully or surrender once again to the ease of automatic living. The enormity of it settled over me with quiet gravity. The world's trajectory depended on these invisible decisions. And for the first time, I felt that collapse was not something out there, but something I could perpetuate or prevent within the narrow, urgent span of my own attention. In the stillness, I understood that the warning had become personal. The night held a weight I had not anticipated, a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as though the world itself were waiting for a response that I had long deferred. Jax's presence did not change, yet the sense of expectation was tangible, pressing against the edges of thought. He did not speak immediately, allowing the silence to carry its own gravity, and in that quiet I could feel the weight of the choice crystallizing, familiar yet profoundly personal. It was the same choice that had appeared across the lives of countless observers, across civilizations, across those who had glimpsed the path of awakening, the path of continued unconsciousness, or the path of deliberate awareness. One was safe, comfortable, unchallenging, a place where the interior noise could be ignored or rationalized away. The other was raw, demanding, exposing every concealment, every habitual escape, every act of avoidance that had been mistaken for living. I felt the tension in my chest tighten, a recognition that this was not a theoretical exercise. Jax had explained before that most people, when confronted with the choice in its starkest form, selected comfort. It was not cowardice. It was survival as they understood it. The habit of avoidance, the craving for reassurance, the pattern of deflection from inner discomfort, these were stronger than insight, stronger than knowledge, stronger than curiosity. Civilization itself seemed to depend on this preference for ease, on the widespread deferral of presence and responsibility. The structures, rituals, and authorities that we had built were the physical manifestations of this collective choice, a scaffold to maintain the illusion of safety while interior collapse silently unfolded. I recognized the truth of Jax's observation in myself immediately. How many times had I ignored the subtle urgencies of my own consciousness? How often had I allowed routine, habit, and distraction to substitute for attention and intentionality? I had read, reflected, and theorized. Yet, the actual work of inhabiting awareness, of meeting the self fully without mediation, had been avoided at nearly every turn. Now, confronted with the clarity of the choice, the familiar refuge of unconsciousness seemed inviting, seductive, almost rational. It promised stability, predictability, and a continuation of life as I had always known it. Yet the cost of that path had never been fully visible until now. Jax remained still, observing without intrusion, as if the universe itself had condensed into this single axis of decision. There was no external pressure, no judgment, no timetable, only the quiet insistence that this moment mattered. The choice was mine, repeated endlessly across time and space, across those who had come before and those who would follow. In the silence, I felt the enormity of possibility, the way a single decision could reverberate inward and outward, touching the quality of consciousness itself. To remain asleep was easy, expected, and yet the pull toward presence, toward living deliberately, trembled just beneath the surface, fragile but unmistakable. I understood then that the question was not whether awakening was possible, but whether I had the courage to inhabit it, to risk the discomfort of clarity, to choose life in its raw, unfiltered form rather than comfort at the expense of awareness. And in that understanding, the choice reappeared, stark, urgent, unavoidable. The days that followed were quieter than usual, but each carried an undercurrent I could not dismiss. The world continued its habitual motion, people moving as though on invisible tracks, conversations repeating familiar loops, distractions humming insistently in the background. And yet I felt the subtle shift that Jax had implied, the sense that the choice, the awakening, was no longer theoretical but demanded action, not in some abstract or mystical sense, but in the smallest, most immediate decisions of daily life. I began to notice the ways life presented tests without fanfare, without signs or ceremonial importance, how the real challenges were hidden within the ordinary, waiting to expose the gaps between understanding and embodiment. It came first as an encounter with someone I had long judged quietly, someone whose behavior had irritated me for years, whose presence I had catalogued and dismissed with polite avoidance. The impulse to lecture, to assert, to defend my perceived moral or intellectual authority arose as naturally as breathing, and I recognized it instantly as the test Jax had spoken of. The moment required honesty, humility, and the willingness to be present with discomfort, to choose connection over ego, awareness over habitual reaction. I paused, feeling the weight of the internal choice, the ease of retreating into old patterns against the effort of embodying the principles I had claimed to understand. It was not dramatic, not heroic, only profound in its quiet insistence. Later, a deeper test arrived in the form of a family dispute, long frozen, a history of betrayal and avoidance stretching back over a decade. The patterns of avoidance, of justification, of silent judgment were entrenched, comforting in their predictability, and I could feel the old defenses rising. Forgiveness, reconciliation, acknowledgement of failure, These were the instruments required, not rhetoric or understanding, but the slow, deliberate willingness to act in accordance with the values I had studied and observed. The challenge was to inhabit them fully, to feel the discomfort of humility and the vulnerability of connection, to risk shame and rejection in the service of truth and presence. Every moment, subtle or overt, tested the alignment between inner recognition and outward behavior. Life itself became the instructor, not through spectacle but through quiet insistence, revealing the depth of my habitual avoidance, the ease with which I had substituted thought for action, knowledge for living. Jax's absence made the test more real, more immediate. There was no longer a voice to guide or a presence to mediate the risk. Only my own choice existed, visible and unavoidable, in the mundane, the relational, the routine, the quiet. The test was not an event but a continuum, a sequence of invitations to act with integrity, with awareness, with courage, or to fall back into the habitual sleep of unconscious living. I realized that awakening was no longer theoretical, that comprehension alone was insufficient, and that life itself, in its unadorned, unyielding reality, had become the final arbiter of whether the lessons observed under Jax's gaze could be embodied or forever remain untested, abstract, incomplete. The moment arrived with quiet inevitability. A situation that should have been simple but carried all the weight of my choices up to that point. It was a test, not announced, not grand, but precise, subtle, unavoidable, the kind of moment life places before you when pretense and habit collide with the possibility of real alignment. I could feel the pulse of it in the small details, the hesitation in my own body, the flicker of fear in my mind, the pull towards safety and familiar patterns. Rationalizations formed instantly, soft excuses that promised comfort and continuity. This was the path I had always chosen without thinking, the one I had rehearsed through years of habit, yet now it came with full awareness of consequence. I told myself the choice did not matter, that context and nuance allowed for compromise, that insight could compensate for action. My intellect cataloged the potential consequences, weighing them with logic and reason, but beneath the surface, I felt the deep, unmistakable tension of something unraveling. Jax had never intervened, never instructed, never imposed. The responsibility was mine entirely, carried in the silence that pressed against thought, in the empty spaces where the truth could no longer be ignored. The rational mind suggested protection, control, and avoidance. Yet I sensed with a subtle terror that this moment was more than habit or preference. It was a fulcrum on which the trajectory of my internal world would pivot. I chose the familiar, the comfortable, the safe retreat into old patterns. Instantly, a hollow satisfaction followed, an illusion of correctness that faded almost immediately, leaving only the quiet intensity of recognition. Intellectual understanding alone meant nothing. Every phrase I had repeated to myself, every insight I had claimed to grasp, every lesson observed under Jax's presence, now confronted me as insufficient, powerless without action. The disconnect between what I knew and what I lived widened, an internal fragmentation that was sharp and undeniable. I could feel the edges of myself splintering, the habitual self-protection no longer insulating me from the truth. Awareness had been offered, opportunity had been present, and I had retreated. The honesty of failure was undeniable, more precise and consequential than any external judgment. It revealed the true position of consciousness, the distance between what I imagined and what I embodied, the quiet inertia of comfort that had governed countless decisions. It was a revelation that cut deeper than fear or shame could have, a mirror held up without commentary, exposing the layers of evasion that I had built over decades. I understood in that moment the weight of alignment, the necessity of courage, and the relentless clarity of life as a testing ground. Failure was no longer abstract. It was present, unyielding, unavoidable. I had chosen sleep over wakefulness, comfort over truth, and the evidence was lodged in the quiet but profound fracture of self that now defined my interior landscape. The second opportunity came not with fanfare or heralded significance, but with a quiet precision that demanded attention if I was willing to notice. It was a moment embedded in the ordinary, a subtle encounter that brushed against the habitual patterns I had relied upon for comfort, yet carried the unmistakable weight of possibility. I felt it immediately, a resonance beneath the surface, a signal of internal consequence that I could neither ignore nor rationalize away. The first choice had been a retreat, an unconscious surrender, but this one presented itself as if life itself were offering a second chance, a quiet reprieve to act with awareness. It required neither drama nor spectacle, only the courage to align thought and action, to embody principles I had understood intellectually, but never lived fully. I sensed the subtle tension within me as I approached the moment. The familiar impulses of avoidance, self-protection, and rational justification surfaced with the ease of old habit. Yet I recognized them now, not as guidance, but as obstacles. The hesitation was brief, yet significant, as I consciously chose to engage differently, to act not from the comfort of habitual response, but from a deliberate intention to embody presence and integrity. The action itself was simple, almost mundane in the eyes of the world. But the internal significance was profound. I felt the weight of alignment pressing against the remnants of fear and ego, a pressure that was unfamiliar yet unmistakably real, as if the fracture I had felt after my first failure was now being slowly bridged. Nothing external shifted dramatically. There was no applause, no recognition, no tangible reward, only the subtle but undeniable sensation of internal stabilization. My awareness expanded, not in grand revelation but in quiet recalibration, a deepening sense that my choices could now reflect the truths I had observed, the lessons Jax had revealed, and the trajectory that Jesus had attempted to communicate. The alignment was incomplete, imperfect, fragile, but present. It felt like stepping onto solid ground after years of wandering in the unsteady currents of habit. A recognition that action, however small, could instantiate real change within the internal landscape. I understood then that awakening was neither sudden nor spectacular. It was cumulative, emerging from repeated moments of conscious choice, from the willingness to act despite fear, from the decision to engage with integrity when habit would have dictated retreat. The quiet clarity of this second opportunity carried an internal resonance that felt like foundation setting. The first tangible evidence that alignment was possible, that knowledge without action could be transformed into lived presence, and that the path forward, though uncertain and incomplete, was accessible if I remained attentive, deliberate, and willing to embody the truths I had once only observed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone but myself, yet unmistakably real. A quiet but profound turning of the inner tide, a moment where intention and awareness met, and I felt, for the first time in years, the possibility of continuing without internal fracture, no longer merely observing life, but beginning to inhabit it fully. The final encounter arrived with a stillness that felt heavier than any presence I had known, yet paradoxically lighter than anything I had carried within myself for decades. Jax appeared among the faint shadows where light lingered uncertainly, neither announcing himself nor demanding notice, simply existing as if reality itself had paused to hold a breath in recognition of what was unfolding. I felt the residual tremors of my previous failures and the subtle steadiness of the second opportunity, and I understood immediately that this moment was neither a test nor a lesson. It was a confirmation, an alignment of perception and truth that had waited patiently until I was prepared enough to receive it. The air around him carried no judgment, only a resonance that seemed to penetrate layers of thought and habit, brushing against the unseen architecture of consciousness itself. The words, did not come through lips, but through an interior certainty, a clarity that bypassed the filter of expectation or interpretation. "You have begun," Jax communicated. "Begun to inhabit the space that has always been available. Begun to act with the alignment that knowledge alone cannot instantiate. Not belief, not faith, not adherence, but embodiment." The essence of Jesus' teaching is found here, not in words spoken long ago, not in rituals repeated across centuries, but in action informed by awareness, in the courage to choose presence over comfort, in the willingness to allow the self to fracture so that it may be reassembled in alignment with what is true. Each hesitation, each failure, each small act of conscious choice has carried you to this point. Each has been a bridge across the internal collapse that Jax has observed in countless civilizations. A bridge built one moment of attention at a time. I felt the weight of that realization press against the boundaries of perception, the cumulative resonance of years of internal noise, habitual avoidance, and fragmented consciousness collapsing into a single line of clarity. This was the moment that crystallized understanding into lived truth. "Humanity is not doomed," Jax continued, "not as a judgment, but as recognition. It is asleep, as many have been before, as many will be, yet the sleep is not permanent. The end of sleep is initiated by a single, genuine act of awakening. And that act is neither abstract nor remote. It begins within. It begins now. It begins with one who chooses to inhabit life fully, to act consciously, to bear the weight of awareness without retreating." I felt a tremor of fear, of humility, of awe, and with it a steady warmth of resolve, the unfamiliar sensation of a self aligned with its own attention. The light around Jax began to dissolve, not abruptly, but as though the world itself acknowledged closure. The soft, fading a signal that no further instruction was needed, that the knowledge had been received and was now inseparable from the act of living. I stood alone in the quiet, but I was not the same. The internal noise had softened, not silenced, but made coherent. The fractures of habit and avoidance now avenues for choice rather than prisons. I understood finally that the work was ongoing, infinite in its unfolding, yet available in every conscious breath. Humanity was not condemned, only asleep. And sleep ends the moment one genuinely chooses to wake. The park, the shadows, the light that had once unnerved me now felt like a mirror, reflecting a possibility I could carry forward, a clarity that was mine to embody. And in that quiet, I understood that the message, at last, had arrived.